Hi, I'm Cora, a student at the Miami Valley School in Dayton, Ohio. As part of the APUSH history class that I've elected to take this year, we are creating videos talking about some facet of the history that we've learned so far that we find particularly interesting. So in history class, we've been talking about the founding of America as a new nation. David Kennedy and Elizabeth Cohen, the authors of the textbook we're using, The American Pageant, emphasized that the founding of America as a new nation occurred as a process. Colonists in America didn't actually want to separate from the crown until well into 1775, when in August, King George III proclaimed that the colonies were rebelling. But before this date, Parliament passed a series of acts in the 1760s and 70s which provoked the agitation of the colonists, which eventually contributed to their urge to found a new nation. But that got me thinking. See, in my AP biology class, we've been talking about the electron transport chain of cellular respiration. The electron transport chain basically begins with these electron carriers called NADH and FADH2, which enter the system at protein complexes like these, embedded in a membrane. The complexes pull the electrons away from the carriers, and then pass the electrons onto more complexes, which go onto more complexes, and they're passed down the chain, kind of like a domino effect, and are finally passed onto oxygen, forming water as a byproduct. But the most important part of this chain is that as the electrons travel onto more and more complexes, they lose some of their energy, which is used for these hydrogen ions to be transported to the other side of the membrane. So these ions build up what's known as a proton motive force, which basically means that some of them want to diffuse to the other side, since there are so many over here. As they diffuse there, they go through ATP synthase, which uses the movement of the ions to create ATP, which fuels the work cells have to do to keep a living thing functioning. So this process is extremely important. So as I was sitting in history class, it hit me. Parliament's acts are a lot like the electron transport chain of biology. One act triggered a whole slew of reactions from colonies, which triggered more acts and more acts and more acts, and that process had huge consequences. Just like the electron transport chain, there were certain ideals and factors that triggered the beginning of the acts imposed by Parliament. Then the acts triggered each other to happen. One act and its consequences leading to another act, leading to another act, leading to another act, just like the chain reaction of the electron transport chain. As that was happening, each act triggered all of these colonial responses, which led to a buildup of agitation and resentment in the colonies. This agitation had detrimental consequences to Britain, just like the chain reaction of the electron transport chain produces ATP, which fuels all of the cellular work of life. So let's look into this in more detail. Kennedy and Cohen attribute the influx of Parliament's acts in the 1760s and 70s partly to the influence of mercantilism, a theory which stated that power could be measured by gold and silver, which could be better collected, with colonies providing British imports and accepting British exports. Therefore, mercantilism allowed the British to justify their power over the colonies. The costly British victory of the Seven Seas War also urged Prime Minister George Grenville to secure from Parliament the new acts by increasing taxation of the colonies. These factors instigated Parliament to enforce the navigation law in 1763, which decreed that all American commerce had to be carried in British ships. The enforcement of the navigation law was the first step in this chain of events, which aroused colonial resentment. George Grenville then enacted a series of acts, like the Sugar Act in 1764, which increased the duty on sugar from the West Indies. In 1765, the Stamp Act was created. This act made colonists use stamped paper on everyday goods to prove that they had paid taxes which supported the military. Although colonists succeeded in getting the Stamp Act repealed, Parliament insisted on declaring that it retained its sovereignty over the colonies, hence the Declaratory Act of 1766. Just like the protein complexes in the electron transport chain I was learning about in biology, I could see a domino effect taking shape in history as acts led to one another, like how the repeal of the Stamp Act led to the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act further led to the next set of acts Parliament passed, known as the Townshend Acts of 1767. These put into action the power Parliament claimed in the Declaratory Act by imposing an import duty on common products, which resulted in increased smuggling activities. The Townshend Act imposed one tax, the tea tax, which especially angered colonists. This act, along with the British East India Company's gain of a complete monopoly over tea, would eventually lead to the Boston Tea Party. This colonial response to the Declaratory Act, which included the Tea Party, led to the acts in 1774 dubbed by the colonists as the Intolerable Acts, which swept away rights of colonial Massachusetts as punishment. The Intolerable Acts spurred the colonies to summon the First Continental Congress, which created the association. The association boycotted British goods, further increasing tensions. The agitation and resentment brewed as a result of these acts caused what Kennedy and Cohen call the ensuing clash that provoked Americans to found a new nation. And that's just like the hydrogen ions, which built up on one side of the membrane and fueled the production of ATP, which is necessary to power almost all of the energy cells use to work. I found this connection so fascinating because these two processes, the founding of a new nation and the production of ATP that fuels cellular work, are literally some of the reasons why I can sit in front of this camera and talk to you about this connection I found. So that was my rant about a cool connection I found between biology and history. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to be awesome.